Karen was the kind of person everyone in the small town knew about, though not always for good reasons. She had a reputation for being overly curious, some might even say nosy. Whether it was peeking over fences to see what her neighbors were up to or asking too many questions at the local coffee shop, Karen couldn't resist poking her nose where it didn't belong. Her latest fixation: Harold's root cellar. Harold lived on the edge of town, a quiet man who preferred solitude over socializing. He kept to himself, tending to his garden and tinkering with old tools in his shed. Most people respected his privacy, but Karen saw his reserved nature as an invitation to dig deeper. Rumors had been swirling around town for weeks about Harold's mysterious root cellar. Some said it was just a place to store vegetables from his garden, while others whispered that it held secrets, hidden treasures, forbidden documents, or perhaps something even stranger. Karen couldn't let it go. One crisp autumn afternoon, Karen decided she'd had enough of speculation. It was time to find out the truth for herself. Armed with a flimsy excuse about needing gardening advice, she marched over to Harold's house. When no one answered the door, Karen felt a flicker of disappointment, but also a spark of opportunity. Harold wasn't home, which meant she could finally investigate without him breathing down her neck. Creeping around the side of the house, Karen spotted the root cellar tucked away near the edge of the property. Its wooden door looked weathered and unassuming, blending into the earth like it belonged there. But Karen wasn't fooled by its humble appearance. To her, it was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. The only problem: it was locked. Undeterred, Karen rummaged through her purse until she found a hairpin. After several failed attempts at picking the lock, frustration bubbled inside her. Just as she was about to give up, she remembered seeing an old crowbar leaning against a neighbor's fence earlier that day. With a grin, she jogged back, grabbed it, and returned to Harold's property. The crowbar made quick work of the stubborn lock. As the door creaked open, Karen hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. The last thing she needed was to get caught red-handed. Satisfied that she was alone, she stepped inside and immediately froze. The root cellar wasn't what she'd expected at all. Instead of dusty shelves filled with cobwebs and forgotten jars, it was clean and organized, almost obsessively so. Fresh produce sat neatly stacked in crates, and along one wall, there were shelves lined with boxes labeled in careful handwriting. A small desk stood in the corner, covered with papers and notebooks. It was clear that Harold used this space for more than storing potatoes. Karen's heart raced with excitement. What was all this stuff? And why did Harold go to such lengths to keep it hidden? She moved closer to examine the items, her curiosity growing with each passing second. But just as she reached for a notebook on the desk, she heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Panic surged through her veins. Someone was coming. Karen's heart pounded as the sound of footsteps grew louder outside. She froze, her fingers inches away from the notebook on the desk. Her mind raced with questions. Was it Harold? Had he seen her sneaking around his property? Or was it someone else entirely? Either way, she knew being caught inside his root cellar would lead to trouble. Big trouble. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Karen held her breath, pressing herself against the wall in the shadows, hoping she'd be invisible. The wooden door creaked open, and a sliver of daylight spilled into the dimly lit space. Harold stepped inside, carrying an empty basket. He didn't notice Karen right away. His attention was focused on gathering potatoes from one of the crates near the far corner. Karen exhaled silently, relieved that she hadn't been spotted. Yet, her relief didn't last long. As Harold turned to place the potatoes in his basket, his foot brushed against something on the floor, a tin can that Karen had accidentally knocked over during her frantic search for clues. The metallic clang echoed through the small cellar, sharp and unmistakable. Harold froze, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but tinged with unease. Karen's stomach churned. She wanted to bolt, to push past him and run out the door, but she knew that would only make things worse. Instead, she stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't spot her hiding behind the stack of crates. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on her side. Harold moved closer, peering into the shadows until his gaze landed directly on her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone rising with anger. Karen stumbled backward, stammering as she tried to come up with an excuse. I was just looking for, gardening tools," she blurted out, though even she could hear how weak the lie sounded. Harold's face hardened. "This is private property," he snapped. "You have no business being in my root cellar." Before Karen could respond, Harold took a step toward her, blocking her path to the exit. Panic surged through her again, and she instinctively backed further into the corner. But Harold didn't seem interested in hearing explanations or apologies. His expression shifted from shock to determination as he reached for the heavy wooden door. With a swift motion, he pulled it shut and twisted the lock into place. The sound of the lock clicking echoed like thunder in the confined space. Karen lunged forward, grabbing the handle and yanking at it desperately, but the door didn't budge. "Wait, you can't leave me in here," she shouted, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I think I just did," Harold replied coolly from the other side of the door. His footsteps faded as he walked away, leaving Karen alone in the eerie silence of the root cellulose. For a moment, all she could do was stare at the locked door, her mind reeling. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? One minute she was indulging her curiosity, and the next, she was trapped underground like some kind of prisoner. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was stuck in a dark, cramped space with no way out, and no idea when, or if, Harold would let her go. Karen sank onto a nearby crate, trying to steady her breathing. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. Shadows danced across the walls as the faint light filtering through cracks in the door began to fade. She glanced around the cellar again, noticing details she'd missed before. There were more boxes than she'd initially realized, their labels written in neat handwriting. Some read tools, while others had cryptic phrases like project notes or personal records. A shiver ran down her spine. What exactly had Harold been hiding down here? As minutes ticked by, Karen's fear gave way to frustration. Who did Harold think he was, locking her up like this? Sure, she shouldn't have broken in, but this reaction seemed extreme. She clenched her fists, vowing to give him a piece of her mind once she got out, or better yet, report him to the authorities. But first, she needed to figure out how to escape. She tested the door again, rattling the handle and pounding on the wood. "Let me out," she yelled, her voice echoing off the stone walls. No response came from above. Just silence. Trapped in the root cellar, Karen's frustration quickly turned into panic. At first, she had been furious at Harold for locking her inside, but as time passed and the reality of her situation sank in, her anger gave way to fear. The small space felt smaller with each passing minute, the air growing heavier and harder to breathe. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, a constant reminder of how alone she was. Karen tried everything she could think of to get out. She pounded on the wooden door until her fists ached, shouting for help at the top of her lungs. "Harold, let me out right now," she screamed, her voice bouncing off the stone walls. But no one answered. Above ground, all was silent. It was as if Harold had simply vanished after locking her away, leaving her to stew in her own mistakes. When yelling didn't work, Karen turned her attention to the door itself. She examined the lock, running her fingers over its rusted surface, hoping to find a way to pick it or force it open. But without tools, or even a hairpin this time, she realized it was useless. The wood was thick and sturdy, built to keep things secure. Every attempt to pry it loose only left her more exhausted and defeated. As the minutes dragged on, Karen began to feel the weight of her surroundings. The dim light filtering through cracks in the door wasn't enough to chase away the shadows that seemed to creep closer with every passing moment. The faint smell of damp earth filled the air, making her skin crawl. She hated enclosed spaces, and being stuck underground made her feel like the walls were closing in on her. Desperation drove her to explore the rest of the cellar, searching for anything that might help her escape, or at least distract her from the rising tide of dread. She rummaged through the boxes stacked neatly along the shelves, pulling out notebooks, faded photographs, and odd trinkets that looked out of place in a storage room meant for vegetables. One box contained old letters tied together with string, their contents written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Another held jars of preserves labeled with dates stretching back years. Each discovery deepened the mystery of Harold's root cellar and Karen's unease. Why would someone store so many personal items in such an isolated spot? What secrets was he hiding? As she sifted through the contents, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something far bigger than she'd bargained for. Her curiosity burned brighter than ever, even as fear gnawed at her resolve. But curiosity wasn't enough to keep the panic at bay forever. Hunger soon joined the mix, gnawing at her stomach as the hours ticked by. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the sight of fresh potatoes and canned goods taunted her from their crates. Still, pride kept her from touching anything. This was Harold's property, and despite her predicament, she refused to take what wasn't hers. The silence became unbearable. Without the sound of footsteps overhead or voices outside, Karen started talking to herself just to fill the void. "You're fine," she muttered under her breath, pacing back and forth across the dirt floor. "Someone will come looking for you eventually." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Who would miss her? Harold clearly wanted her gone, and her nosy tendencies had already driven most of her neighbors away. For all anyone knew, she was off meddling somewhere else. As evening approached, the temperature in the cellar dropped sharply, sending shivers down her spine. Karen wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm. She leaned against the cold stone wall, staring at the locked door, willing it to open. Tears welled up in her eyes as exhaustion took hold. All she wanted was to go home, to crawl into bed and forget this nightmare had ever happened. But for now, there was nothing she could do except wait and hope Harold would return before it was too late. Hours passed, and the root cellar grew darker and colder. Karen sat on a wooden crate, her arms wrapped tightly around herself to ward off the chill. The faint light that had filtered through the cracks in the door earlier was almost completely gone now, plunging the space into near-total darkness. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and shifting as if they were alive. Every creak of the old wooden beams overhead made her jump, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Karen's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. Would Harold come back? Or had he decided to leave her down here indefinitely, punishing her for trespassing? She tried to convince herself that he wouldn't do something so extreme, but doubt gnawed at her. Harold wasn't like other people. His quiet demeanor and secretive nature made him unpredictable. For all she knew, he could be plotting something worse. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten. The smell of potatoes and canned goods surrounded her, tempting her despite her pride. Finally, unable to resist any longer, she reached for a jar of pickles sitting nearby. Unscrewing the lid, she took a cautious bite, the tangy flavor doing little to lift her spirits. It was a small comfort in an otherwise unbearable situation. As the silence pressed down on her, Karen's thoughts turned inward. She replayed the events of the day over and over in her head, cringing at her own impulsiveness. Why hadn't she just stayed away from Harold's property? Her curiosity had always gotten her into trouble, but this time it had landed her in a nightmare. She thought about apologizing to Harold when, or if, he came back, though she doubted he'd accept it after what she'd done. Then there were the boxes. In her boredom, she continued rifling through them, uncovering more oddities that only deepened her unease. One contained old newspaper clippings about missing persons cases from decades ago. Another held maps marked with strange symbols and notes scribbled in the margins. A third box revealed photographs of unfamiliar faces, their expressions frozen in time. Each discovery felt like a puzzle piece she couldn't quite fit together, raising more questions than answers. "What is all this stuff?" Karen whispered aloud, holding up a faded photograph to the dim light. The face staring back at her seemed vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. Was this some kind of hobby of Harold's, or was he involved in something far more sinister? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Karen heard footsteps outside. Her heart leaped with hope, but it quickly sank when she realized they weren't approaching the cellar. Instead, they moved farther away, fading into the distance. Whoever it was, they hadn't noticed her cries for help. Or worse, they hadn't cared. The isolation weighed heavily on her. Karen began to imagine scenarios where no one ever found her, where she remained trapped in this dark, cold space forever. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly to comfort herself. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, trying to shake off the morbid thoughts. But the fear lingered, clinging to her like a second skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone returning. Footsteps approached the door, slow and deliberate. Karen scrambled to her feet, rushing to the entrance and pounding on the wood with renewed energy. "Harold, please, let me out," she shouted, her voice hoarse from hours of yelling. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the sound of a key turning in the lock broke the silence. The door creaked open, revealing Harold standing in the doorway with a lantern in hand. His expression was unreadable, his eyes scanning the interior of the cellar before settling on Karen. "You shouldn't have come here," he said flatly, his tone devoid of sympathy. Karen stared at him, equal parts relief and anger coursing through her veins. She wanted to lash out, to demand answers or accuse him of wrongdoing, but exhaustion and fear kept her silent. For now, the flickering light from Harold's lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls of the root cellar as he stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on Karen. She blinked against the sudden brightness, squinting up at him with a mix of relief and defiance. Her legs felt weak after hours of pacing and sitting on the cold ground, but she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to let him see how much this ordeal had shaken her. "You shouldn't have come here," Harold repeated, his voice low and steady. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a statement, delivered with a weight that made Karen bristle. "And you shouldn't have locked me in here," she shot back, her voice rising with indignation. "Do you know what it's like to be stuck underground for hours? It's freezing and dark, and—" She cut herself off, realizing how close she was to losing control again. Taking a deep breath, she crossed her arms and glared at him. "What were you thinking?" Harold didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped further into the cellar, holding the lantern high to illuminate the space. His eyes scanned the shelves, the desk, and the scattered items Karen had been examining earlier. When his gaze landed on the open box of newspaper clippings and photographs, his jaw tightened ever so slightly. For the first time, Karen noticed a flicker of unease in his expression. "Were you going through my things?" he asked, his tone sharper now. There was no mistaking the accusation in his voice. Karen hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She could lie, deny it, or try to downplay her actions, but something about the way he looked at her made honesty feel like the only option. "Yes," she admitted reluctantly, "but only because I wanted to know why you're keeping all this stuff hidden down here. What are those maps? And those clippings about missing people? What is this place, Harold?" Her barrage of questions hung in the air between them, unanswered. Harold sighed deeply, running a hand over his face as if trying to decide what to say next. Finally, he spoke, though his words offered little clarity. "This isn't about you, Karen. You don't understand what you've stumbled into. That's exactly why I'm asking." Karen snapped, frustration bubbling over. "You can't just lock someone in a root cellar and expect them to forget everything they saw. If there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, then explain it to me." Harold's patience seemed to waver. He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice firm. "Some things are private for a reason. Things that don't concern anyone else. You came snooping where you weren't invited, and now you're paying the price for it." Karen clenched her fists, anger flaring again. "So you admit it. You're hiding something. Are those maps part of some illegal scheme? Or are you involved in something even worse?" Her mind raced with wild theories, each one more alarming than the last. The more Harold avoided answering, the guiltier he seemed. Harold shook his head, clearly exasperated. "I'm not involved in anything illegal," he insisted, though his evasive tone did little to reassure her. "But I won't have my privacy invaded by someone who thinks they're entitled to answers they haven't earned." The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Karen knew she was pushing too hard, but she couldn't stop herself. This was her chance to uncover the truth, or at least force Harold to confront whatever secrets he'd been guarding so fiercely. "If you're innocent, prove it," she challenged. "Call the sheriff. Let him see what's down here. Prove that I'm wrong." For a moment, Harold said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the cellar, leaving Karen standing alone once again. She followed him cautiously, unsure whether he intended to leave her behind or finally address the situation properly. As she emerged into the cool night air, blinking against the moonlight, she saw Harold grab his phone from the kitchen counter inside the house. He dialed a number, speaking briefly before hanging up. Turning back to Karen, he gave her a hard look. "The sheriff will be here soon. Until then, don't move." Karen nodded slowly, her heart pounding. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The truth about Harold and his mysterious root cellar was about to come to light. The wait for the sheriff felt like an eternity. Karen stood awkwardly in Harold's yard, her arms crossed tightly against the chilly night air. She glanced at Harold occasionally, who paced back and forth near the house, his face unreadable. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. Neither spoke, but their earlier argument lingered in the silence, each replaying the confrontation in their minds. When the sound of a car engine finally broke the quiet, both turned toward the driveway. A police cruiser pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sheriff Miller stepped out, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the scene. He was a tall man with graying hair and a calm demeanor that often helped diffuse tense situations. Tonight, however, his presence seemed to amplify the unease. "What's going on here?" the sheriff asked, glancing between Karen and Harold. His tone was neutral, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. Karen didn't waste a second. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here," she began, stepping forward eagerly. "Harold locked me in his root cellar for hours. I came over to ask him about gardening tools, and when I accidentally knocked something over, he just threw me in there and left me." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, turning to Harold. "Is that true?" Harold sighed heavily, shaking his head. "Not exactly," he replied. "She broke into my property, Sheriff. I found her snooping around my root cellar, going through my personal belongings. I didn't know what else to do, so I locked her in until I could figure out how serious the situation was." The sheriff frowned, clearly sensing the complexity of the story. "All right, let's take this one step at a time. Karen, why were you in the root cellar?" Karen hesitated, realizing how flimsy her excuse sounded now. "I thought maybe he kept extra tools down there," she stammered. "But then I saw all these strange things. Boxes of old papers, maps, newspaper clippings. And I got curious. I wasn't trying to steal anything, I swear." The sheriff nodded slowly, jotting notes in his pad. Then he turned to Harold. "And what about you? Care to explain what's in the root cellar?" Harold hesitated, visibly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "It's private," he said firmly. "Personal records, family history, some old projects I've been working on. Nothing illegal, I promise." "Then you won't mind if we take a look," the sheriff replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Harold led the way to the root cellar, with Karen trailing close behind, eager to see how this would unfold. Inside, the sheriff examined the contents carefully, rifling through boxes and inspecting the labeled shelves. Karen watched anxiously, hoping for evidence that would vindicate her suspicions, or at least embarrass Harold. But as the minutes passed, the sheriff's expression remained neutral. "Well," he said finally, closing one of the boxes, "it looks like harmless stuff to me. Old documents, keepsakes, supplies. Nothing that screams trouble." He turned to Karen. "Did you find anything specific that concerned you?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but faltered. The newspaper clippings and maps had certainly seemed suspicious in the dim light of the cellar, but now, under the sheriff's practical gaze, they didn't look less sinister. Still, she couldn't let it go entirely. "It just feels off," she admitted lamely. "Why keep all this hidden away? Why not store it in the house?" The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Fair question," he said, turning back to Harold. "Care to explain?" Harold rubbed the back of his neck, looking more weary than defensive. "Like I said, it's personal. Some of it's tied to my late father. He was big on preserving memories and keeping detailed records. Other stuff is from hobbies or projects I work on alone. I value my privacy, Sheriff. That's all." The sheriff studied Harold for a moment before nodding. "All right, I believe you. But Karen," he added, turning to her, "breaking into someone's property is still trespassing. You can't go poking around people's private spaces without permission. Next time, knock first, or better yet, stay out altogether." Karen flushed with embarrassment, knowing she'd been in the wrong. Still, she couldn't resist one last jab. "He shouldn't have locked me in there." "He shouldn't have reacted so drastically," the sheriff agreed, leveling a stern look at Harold. "But two wrongs don't make a right. Let's call it even and move on, all right?" Both parties reluctantly nodded, though neither looked particularly pleased. As the sheriff packed up and prepared to leave, Karen realized this bizarre day wasn't going to end with fireworks or confessions. It was ending with a lesson in boundaries, trust, and consequences. After the sheriff left, the night air felt heavier than before, the tension between Karen and Harold still lingering like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Neither spoke as they stood in the dim glow of the porch light, each lost in their own thoughts. The sheriff's words echoed in their minds. He had been fair but firm, holding both of them accountable for their roles in the chaotic evening. Now, it was up to them to decide what came next. Karen finally broke the silence, her voice softer than it had been all night. "I'm sorry," she said, though the apology came out haltingly, as if she wasn't used to admitting fault. "I shouldn't have gone into your root cellar without asking. It was disrespectful." Harold looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't respond, and Karen wondered if he would simply walk away without another word. But then he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're right," he admitted reluctantly, "and I shouldn't have locked you in there. That was extreme. I just didn't know how else to handle it." The mutual acknowledgement of their mistakes created a small crack in the wall of animosity that had built between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Karen shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the darkened root cellar. "So, what's really down there?" she asked cautiously. "I mean, I get that it's personal, but maps? Newspaper clippings? It's not every day you see stuff like that." Harold hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. Finally, he shrugged. "Like I told the sheriff, most of it's tied to my dad. He was obsessed with history, local history, family history, anything he could dig up. Some of those clippings are about old cases he followed when he was younger. The maps were part of a hobby he had, marking places he wanted to explore." He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "As for the rest, it's just things I've kept over the years. Memories, projects, stuff I don't want cluttering up the house." Karen nodded slowly, processing his explanation. While it didn't completely erase her curiosity or her lingering doubts, it made sense in a way she hadn't expected. She realized now that her assumptions about Harold had been unfair, fueled by gossip and her own overactive imagination. "I guess I jumped to conclusions," she admitted quietly. "I thought you were hiding something bad." Harold gave her a wry smile. "Not everyone has skeletons in their closet, Karen. Sometimes people just value their privacy." The comment stung slightly, but Karen knew he was right. Her nosiness had caused problems before, and tonight had been a harsh reminder of where it could lead. Determined to make amends, she straightened her posture and met his gaze. "Look, I'll leave you alone from now on. No more snooping, no more questions. You won't even know I'm here." To her surprise, Harold shook his head. "No need to go that far," he said. "Maybe we both need to try being neighborly. If you'd come to me directly instead of sneaking around, none of this would have happened." His words caught Karen off guard. Was Harold actually suggesting they move past this awkwardness and try to coexist peacefully? It seemed unlikely, given everything that had transpired, but there was sincerity in his tone. Slowly, she smiled. "Okay," she said. "Neighborly it is." As Karen walked back to her house, the cool night air felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of the day's drama had lifted just enough to let her breathe again. Back inside his home, Harold locked the Roots cellar door securely, vowing to install better lighting and maybe even a security camera to prevent future incidents. Both of them knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. Old habits die hard, but they also understood that sometimes understanding and compromise can grow from the most unlikely situations. In the days that followed, Karen made an effort to keep her distance while still exchanging polite greetings with Harold whenever their paths crossed. And Harold, for his part, found himself smiling faintly whenever he saw her waving from across the fence. Though neither would forget the bizarre events of that autumn evening, they had taken the first steps toward turning a contentious relationship into something quieter, and perhaps even a little bit friendlier.